Hello, my name is Frank Gaffney. I'm delighted to be officiating in a conversation with one of my all-time favorite people. Her name is Dr. Suzanne Scholte. We're going to be talking about the big picture of what is taking place on the Korean Peninsula, and in particular, a subject to which she has devoted much of her professional life and done so with great effect, namely the plight of the long-suffering people of North Korea, whose human rights have been abused by the regime that is wholly unaccountable to them or anybody else, now for decades under the Kim dynasty. Suzanne Scholte is the president of a wonderful organization here in Washington, the Defense Forum Foundation. She is also the chairman of the North Korea Freedom Coalition, which is an umbrella group of all of the defectors or escapees from North Korea who have testified to what is going on there and informed much of her research and advocacy. And I want to just say, Suzanne, thank you for taking some time to talk with us about this really important portfolio. And I'm thrilled to have a chance to do it with you at some length, but I always wanted to have an opportunity to really understand how you got into this particular portfolio. I know you've got a wide-ranging set of interests. You've run for Congress. You've been very much involved with the national security issues of the United States. But how did you come by this fixation with and advocacy for the people of North Korea?
The way I got involved is our foundation, the Defense Forum Foundation, was chiefly focused on national security issues, making sure that America was strong. And it was it's a bipartisan foundation when Democrats and Republicans all agreed peace through strength, that we needed to be the strongest. And as a matter of fact, I think you were probably the most popular speaker that we had, because I know we had you back quite a few times. You spoke about different threats, whether it was missiles, nuclear missiles, or whether it was China. So the foundation was focused on threats to the United States. And I thought, every country that's a threat to the United States is a threat to their own people, without exception. Yes. And that we should expand our focus to not just concentrate on keeping America strong, but also on trying to help those that were living under these regimes that were threats. And so we started bringing in defectors, people that escaped from Soviet Union at the time, Communist China, Cuba. And I thought, I want to hear from somebody from North Korea. So back in 1996, I started beating down the door of the South Korean embassy saying, why don't you allow us to host a defector on Capitol Hill, as we were doing with all our forums. But for our listeners, the forums were on Capitol Hill. We have all these dissidents, defectors that we've hosted, but we've never heard from a North Korean. And it took me about a year of trying to convince them this was important, because there weren't a lot of defectors at the time. And they were all under basically under the protection of the South Korean government. So we hosted the first defectors that had ever spoken out in the United States of America in 1998. It was Colonel Chae-ju Hall and a diplomat, Ko Young-hwan. And it was fascinating because they told us about what was going on in North Korea. And in fact,
first-hand witness to the horrors.
Exactly. And this was when the famine was going on in the 1990s, when it was first starting to get really serious. And they stood in front of the audience and they said, look at us. We are living proof before your eyes that the regime is misusing humanitarian aid. Because the colonel looked like he'd never missed a meal. He was very, strong and looked very physically fit, whereas the diplomat was kind of tall and scrawny. In fact, I didn't recognize him when I saw him several years later because he'd filled out. But they said, we're military first. Your humanitarians are going to us first, then the diplomats, then the elites. The people are not seeing any of it. And they explained the manipulation of what was going on. And they said something interesting.
Before we get into some more of the details here, because that's really compelling, but just back the lens up for 1 second. The concern that you had, and I think it's both appropriate and not as widely understood as it should be, is that you have people who are engaged in this kind of brutal repression of their own people. Why should that matter to other people? Like us, for example.
Well, because first of all, I think that anybody who lives in freedom has a moral duty to uphold the rights of those who live in tyranny.
Amen.
I think we have that obligation as a free people to care about others. And so what I've tried to argue for people that don't believe in that, because I'm a Christian, so I'm motivated by doing good for others and caring for others, which we're called to do. But if I can't convince you that that's the right way forward, then can I
morally, yeah.
Can I convince you that a regime like North Korea that's threatening peace is also threatening their own people? So it's incumbent in our best interest to help liberate those people, because free countries don't go around threatening to destroy other countries. And
I put it a little differently, but I think it gets you to the same basic endpoint. If you mistreat your own people so horrifically,
right,
you're unlikely to be terribly concerned about the well-being of other people. And I think that's true in spades of this regime, the North Korean.
Absolutely.
But it's a general rule of thumb with respect to those who oppress people under other, regimes or ideologies. But this brings us back to the insights. And you mentioned that initially there were very few defectors.
Right.
And I know you want to share with us some of the things that have been changing
right,
in North Korea that give hope that something might ultimately be done to improve the human rights condition of the North Korean people, if not actually, as I think we should, help bring about their liberation from the horrors of this regime. But talk a little bit about the evolution of the situation in terms of the sheer quantity of these witnesses who are now free in South Korea or elsewhere around the world and able to bear witness, as you said, to the nightmare that is North Korea.
Well, first of all, some of the changes that have happened that have been very dramatic are that there are so many defectors now. And when we had the first hearing,
give us a sense of how many.
Over 35,000, and that's just in South Korea. There's thousands of others that have resettled in other countries like England, Canada, the United States. But these eyewitnesses, just the volume of information that came out was just overwhelming. And just to highlight this, 1999, we organized the first hearing on the political prisoner camps. It was then Senator John Kerry and then Senator Craig Thomas, Democrat and Republican, who hosted the first hearing in 1999, and we had 3 survivors of the political prisoner camps. But the State Department blocked the story about reporting on it because they weren't sure of the credibility of the witnesses, and they were getting ready to have the 4-party talks. They were getting ready to negotiate on the nuclear issue.
Can't interfere with the negotiations with the North.
Exactly. And so it took so long, but fast forward to what happened in 2014, the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in North Korea established that the regime was committing crimes against humanity that have no parallel in the world and gross violations of human rights, which is exactly
saying something.
Exactly. Those are the things that we had been claiming and declaring for decades. But it's all
based
these witnesses,
on these eyewitnesses
right,
and their experiences. And just if you would, obviously we don't want to compromise anybody's future use of the means by which they've gotten away from the North Korean regime, but how do people get away from the most repressive police state apparatus arguably in the world?
Right. Well, there's an underground railroad, and I know one woman, I call her the Harriet Tubman of North Korea. She's rescued thousands and thousands of North Koreans, but there's an underground railroad. The railroad is shut down right now because of COVID. But that's how people have been escaping. That railroad has shifted. They've been going through Thailand. Sometimes they're going through Mongolia, but they have to go through China to get out and to get. It's an extremely dangerous journey.
And I do want to talk maybe here later as you choose about China and the role that it is playing in enabling this regime to persist and engage in this kind of horrific behavior. If it weren't for the Chinese Communist Party, presumably there would be no North Korean regime. Would you agree?
Right.
And so how are they treating those who are fleeing the repression in the North Korean part of the peninsula?
Well, China signed the the Refugee Convention. The Refugee Convention that obligates it not to repatriate anybody that will face persecution, of well-rounded fear of persecution.
Which would be everybody.
Anybody who crosses that border from North Korea will 100% be tortured, 100% be detained, and in some cases publicly executed for crossing the border because it's a crime against the state to leave the country without permission.
Right.
So all of them are at risk.
And as I understand it, Suzanne, it's not just the individuals who've actually made this trip. It would be family members who would be punished as well. Is that right?
Well, in North Korea, if you are accused of a crime, they're going to lock up your entire family.
Wow.
That's part of the
Any
punishment.
crime, not let alone one
So
as egregious as betraying the country.
It could be watching a South Korean soap opera or maybe a Western movie. But
Wow.
yeah, that could be a crime. Or not properly bowing to the statues, not crying enough when Kim Jong-il died.
Yeah.
That could have landed you in a prison camp too.
No
So
kidding.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's important to keep coming back to this point.
Mhm.
There are lots of terrible regimes in this world and have been over the course of history. But to say this one is without parallel, and that anecdote about, if you didn't weep passionately enough or profusely enough, that could result in your entire family winding up in the gulag is saying something, needless to say. But in China, what is the fate of those who managed to get out of North Korea these days?
Well, right now we believe there's between 600 and 1,200 refugees in detention right now, and we have been appealing
In detention in
China, right? And I have to say that they are in extreme peril because if they escaped over these last several years, they had to have means, and the only people that have means are Korean Worker Party member or people who have family.
And
in
the
South
Korean
Korea,
Worker Party is, of course, the party of the
party that
government.
controls, the regime, the loyalists to the regime, or people that
So
had
those
family.
are defectors in the most extreme sense
Exactly,
of the word.
and they had family in South Korea. If it's found out that you were trying to get to South Korea, that's you could be publicly executed for that. And if you're a Korean Workers' Party and betrayed, you could be executed for that. So these people
They
are
have
in
to make
extreme
an
peril.
example of you, I would think, to make sure it doesn't happen.
So I would say that
again.
they're in grave peril. But we've been trying to make the appeal to the Moon government and to the Chinese government. This is a time North Korea has closed their border.
Mm-hmm.
They're not accepting refugees back right now because of the border being closed. So this is
Due to COVID.
due to COVID. And North Korea is so terrified of COVID. Of course, according to WHO, they have no cases. They've had no deaths. They've had no, anyway, if you look at the WHO, there's no COVID in North Korea.
You're laughing sardonically that
Yes,
that's unlikely to be the case.
Yeah, well, we're hearing all kinds of horror stories
I
about
imagine.
what's going on internally. But so with North Korea's recent missile tests, in the past, we've seen China show their displeasure with all the nuclear testing by allowing refugees to go to South Korea. So we feel like we've got this opportunity right now to have all those refugees rescued and allowed to go to South Korea.
So there's 600 to 1,200
They're-
incarcerated in China.
At this time.
Are there others that are at large in China, do you think?
Well,
or
there
is
are
basically anybody who makes it in goes to jail?
Well, there are quite a number of trafficked victims in China right now.
I can imagine.
Thousands and thousands.
Particularly women, I would
Including,
imagine.
because China had this one child policy for so long, they have a shortage of women. You've got North Korea. In fact, I got to tell you about one of the dramatic changes that happened in North Korea with women, which is the markets that
Yes.
the system they created. But it's the women. Most of the refugees were women. They crossed the border. They crossed the border thinking they're going to get a job in a Chinese family, being a nanny, and the next thing they know, they've got a hood put over their head and they're being sold in a market, no different than a slave market.
Yeah.
And so there's
into
a
brothels or
into brothels, into internet pornography, where they're held against their will, or to be the wife of a Chinese farmer living in a rural area. And it's a terrible situation, but there's a lot of, if you go into a rural area in China, some small town in China, you would find a lot of wives that are North Korean.
Okay.
And they've got no rights, their children have no rights. So it's a really terrible situation.
So it does bring us to the next topic
Yeah.
in this evolution of the situation that is somewhat hopeful. Talk about women and their
Yeah.
role in trying to forge some kind of market system within this communist state.
Yeah, I have to tell you that this is so underappreciated. The women of North Korea created a capitalist system. They created the free market system out of sheer desperation during the famine, during the Arduous March, when there was millions of people dying. They became entrepreneurs because the men were having to go to work, showing up the factories and not getting paid anything. The regime was collapsing. And the public distribution system was totally collapsing. So women went out and became entrepreneurs to desperation to feed their children, their husbands, their parents. and they saved the country. And the regime tried repeatedly to control these markets. It would come up with schemes like you had to be 35 years or older or you couldn't use the market, or you had to be 45 years. It's just all these different rules and regulations. They kept trying to put their grasp on these markets because they were popping up all over the country. And they completely failed, and there was a turning point. In 2009, they tried to reinvent a new currency, again, to try to take control of the market economy. And they failed miserably. There was such a pushback in the country that they ended up executing a North Korean, saying it was his fault, it was his idea, and they offed him, and they stepped back and they allowed the markets to function. So I want to give you a statistic that came out of a Center for Strategic and International Studies survey of people that have escaped. They found, this is several years ago, they found 72% of respondents from their survey said they received almost all of their household income from the markets. Wow. 72%. And 83% found the outside goods and information that was coming from the outside, had greater impact on their lives than the regime itself. Now, this is incredible because everything was controlled until this market system through the public distribution system, so that everybody had to be dependent on the regime, whether it was a refrigerator, whether you got rice. In fact, that was one of the things that the colonel told us about the humanitarian aid going in, and how the humanitarian groups, the World Food Program trucks, would go and deliver the rice, and then the army trucks would come back in after they left town and get all that rice back. But everything was distributed and controlled. Everything. Where you live, what you ate, whether you had a refrigerator or Mercedes-Benz. And so that system breaking down, women created the market system. That's how they're surviving today. That's why there's really, I'm not going to suggest that things have gotten better. I mean, there are famine-like conditions in North Korea now, but the reason why you don't see the level of starvation, where 3 million people starved to death, was because of these markets.
So, Suzanne Scholte, this is a remarkable testament to the adage, I think, that Margaret Thatcher came up with initially, which is that the trouble with socialism is that you wind up running out of other people's money to spend on it. There's no money in North Korea to speak of, other than, I guess, what's being brought in by the benighted West or the Communist Chinese Party. But what you're saying is that there has now been some kind of accommodation by the regime to the reality that this is a necessary life support system, basically, for the people, and they're managing to keep it going. God bless them. Let me turn to one other change, which I know you have been instrumental in. You have been working closely with the Free North Korean radio service. Talk a little bit about the access to information that people in the North now have, and the degree to which the defectors themselves have been instrumental in helping achieve that.
Well, we had an operation called Operation Geely, which is truth. It was an operation by the U.S. Army to get information in North Korea through using balloons. And then the South Korean government took that project over after the end of the Korean War. But it was a positive propaganda, getting information in. And the South Korean government, during the times when they were trying to appease the regime, they stopped doing all these programs. So the defectors have stepped up and taken over these programs. And I'm going to just give you, I always say it's by land, by sea, and by air. So what they've been doing is trying to get information into North Korea. We know that at least 60% of the people have had access to outside information. They were watching Western movies. They're watching K-pop. They're listening to K-pop music. They love South Korean soap operas, for example. So all this information has been pouring in. The North Korea...
Which sheds light on what it's like on the other side of the demilitarized zone and what they're being deprived of.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I always say that Kim Jong-un's North Korea is not the Korea of Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il because of these dramatic changes, because of the flow of information. And it kind of started out in the beginning, the soap operas, North Koreans would watch the soap operas and they were fascinated by the household items that South Korean women had. The kitchen gadgets fascinated them. I always like to tell a story about the Titanic, which became a sensation. That film became a sensation in North Korea. I know so many people that watched it. And the regime had to come up with some kind of propaganda to address the popularity of the Titanic, because what it showed was something that just blew their minds, which was somebody sacrificing their life for another out of love. And it was a mind-blowing movie because of that, because they're only to sacrifice for the dictator. So they had to come up with a way to address it. So the regime came up with their own propaganda, which was the Titanic was not really a movie, a love story. It was actually a movie depicting the failure and death of capitalism, because the Titanic went down on the exact same day that Kim Il-sung was born. What a great propaganda officer that came up with that one. But this flow of information, they're doing it by land, by sea, by air. So just to give you some examples, we always talk about the truth will set them free. That's the North Korean defectors. I work with all those groups. The truth will set them free. We always talk about when does the regime collapse? Tomorrow, because we do believe that regime, when people learn the truth, they will get rid of that dictatorship. When they find out that what we care about is the people. We care about the people in North Korea. So so just to give you some idea, Operation Gila I mentioned was balloon launches. The defectors have taken that up. There were 10 organizations that were doing it. And the one that was the most controversial is Park Sung-hak. And the reason why Park Sung-hak is so controversial is because he's been calling the dictatorship out. He's been calling out the dictatorship for killing Otto Warmbier, for killing his own uncle.
That American citizen who was incarcerated and then essentially killed by the North Korean regime.
And so he gets attacked a lot by the North Korea regime. But there's 10 groups that are doing the balloon launches just to get information in, and it was a proven technique.
And what goes along with the balloons?
They've been sending in U.S. $1 bills. The U.S. $1 bill is very strong in the market. It used to be able to feed a family of 4 for a week. I don't know what the value is now because of the COVID. There's less information coming out. But U.S. dollar bill is extremely popular in the North Korean markets. They were sending in recently PPE, like masks and stuff, but they've been sending in shortwave. They've sent in shortwave radios. They've sent in, they call them nose cards. SD cards are really small for transferring information. So they were sending in Choco pies, which are very popular in North Korea. Like, look at this Choco pie. This is amazing, this chocolate goodness from South Korea. But all these things are sending in, by the balloons. And then, of course, they have developed ways to get stuff across the border. The defectors came up with a brilliant idea. They got these things called notels, which is can use SD card, CDs, USBs can be used by it to see information. The notels that the North Korean defectors smuggled in with the help of the South Korean government at the time, they got in 30 to 50,000 of these things, and they became so popular that the regime had to decriminalize ownership of them and started creating their own. So this was another technique they came up with. And then I mentioned by air, and I mentioned over the land. There was one defector, Chung Kwan-il, he was using drones to take stuff over the border. Now that, of course, because of COVID, they haven't been able to do cross-border transfers, but
so talk about by sea quickly. Because talk about by sea.
Oh, and then by sea, another technique. Yeah, I was gonna.
We're almost out of time, and I just need to.
I brought this along. Because I've talked about
show
rice.
And tell.
Yeah, rice bottle launches.
Dollar bill prominently displayed.
Exactly. This was a technique that was developed by the defectors. Several groups are also doing this. They're still doing it. It's against the law in South Korea now because the Moon administration, everything the Moon administration is doing is responding to the requests of the Kim regime because they're doing more to help the Kim regime than they are the North Korean people. But this was developed by a defector who had served in the military, was patrolling North Hwanghae province, saw the trash coming in from South Korea and said, all these years later, he said, we can use the currents.
We can get it in.
So we can get in by that.
Naturally.
And this is rice, U.S. $1 bill. There's a SD card in here. There's also parasite medicine. We saw that defector that came over that was riddled. His body was riddled with parasitical parasites. So they send in parasite medicine, Bible, all this stuff.
This is a fascinating treatment of a subject that I think, for the reasons we talked about at the outset, Suzanne Scholte, should be on all of our hearts as well as a strategic consideration for us. I'm very pleased that we're going to have a chance to continue our conversation and talk a bit more about the Moon regime, what it is doing in South Korea, and the dangers that it represents, that it seems to be willing to, well, among other things, reunify with the North on the North's terms, meaning the South Korean people could be treated this appallingly badly as well. But before we get to that, we're going to say thank you for your visit with us in this block and for really exposing what we're up against, and I think the world should be against in North Korea, and for your leadership in fighting it. Thank you, Suzanne Scholte. I hope you will be back for more of The Big Picture in the near future. Till then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for being with us.